when we were with them, they fired six shots in order to destroy the kind of Russian bunker that they were attacking, which had five Russian troops in it. And we saw how they'd impacted the target. They showed us on the drone feed how that worked. But as soon as they'd done that, as soon as we kind of ran back to cover in another bunker, there was a Russian drone in the air already hunting for this crew and for the artillery piece. And that's how the war is working now. Something you open fire and you're immediately searched for by an enemy drone in the air. And it was an FPV drone which could have immediately hit the artillery piece. And then you're kind of in cover for hours waiting for this drone to clear.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Maxim Tucker, the Times' Ukraine correspondent who has just returned from a visit to Ukraine. Maxim, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me again.
Maxim, you've been on the front this month alongside Ukrainian troops. What can you tell us about what you saw?
So we were the special kind of unit, the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is thought to be one of Ukraine's best units. It is led by a Ukrainian nationalist, a far-right politician who's turned it to a military career. And they are particularly motivated, quite well equipped. He's opened up his armed forces to experimental technology from the West. And they have been having some success that other units are not enjoying on the front line, particularly because they are very strongly staffed. Their recruitment is very strong. People want to join the 3rd Assault Brigade. And they are able to hold a longer section of the front line. It shows you what is possible if Ukrainian brigades were well staffed and well equipped and had the right technology. That's something the 3rd Assault Brigade provides for its soldiers. And they're holding the front line at Izium remarkably well when other sectors of the front line, the Ukrainians are being pushed back by the Russians.
And you were spending time specifically with a group of soldiers that were operating a British-made mobile howitzer, as it were. What can you tell us about that vehicle and how they were using it?
Yeah, so in May, the UK retired its entire fleet of some 87 AS-90s, British-designed self-propelled howitzers. And this brigade has got at least 12 of them. There's a full division working. We went to see how they operate and how effective these weapons are in their hands. And they told us how much they enjoyed using them, how much they were able to use the barrel, which is thought to be, expire after 1,000 usage. They were using them up to 8,000 times and then replacing the barrel. And they would have to make some allowances for accuracy, decreasing after that amount of time. But it does show that it's still useful to donate weapons that are fast becoming outmoded because of the rapidly advancing technology in this war. Western arsenals, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, if they're not kind of AI driven, if they're not semi-automated or fully automated, if they're not small and nimble and inexpensive, they're not going to be as useful in future wars because they'll just be outmatched by small, nimble drones. And so it made sense, I think, for the UK to retire those weapons, and it makes even more sense to put them to good use in Ukraine while they can still have an impact.
And in your article on your time in Ukraine, you spoke about how they were using these sort of shoot and scoot or even shoot and take cover tactics. How's that come to characterize the warfare in Ukraine? And can you tell us a bit about how they were utilizing that with this vehicle?
Right, so it's quite different. The war changes quite dramatically, I'd say, every month. And from one year to the next, it's almost unrecognizable in terms of the way that's being fought. So artillery, a year or two ago, would be using these shoot and scoot techniques. You would fire a shot or two and then go back to somewhere else and take cover. These AS-90s they're big, heavy, 45-ton machines, so they're not particularly mobile, they're not nimble, and they are vulnerable to FPV drone attacks. So what the Ukrainians have done instead is they try and conceal these weapons as much as possible, try and protect them with netting, and they just kind of push them out for a short period of time and then go back to cover in the tree line. And they don't want to fire a lot because they will be exposed. And when we were with them, they fired six shots in order to destroy the kind of Russian bunker that they were attacking, which had five Russian troops in it. and we saw how they'd impacted the target. They showed us on the drone feed how that worked. But as soon as they'd done that, as soon as we kind of ran back to cover in another bunker, there was a Russian drone in the air already hunting for this crew and for the artillery piece. And that's how the war is working now. Something, you open fire and you're immediately searched for by an enemy drone in the air. And it was an FPV drone which could have immediately hit the artillery piece. And then you're kind of in cover for hours waiting for this drone to clear. I think what was quite good about the 3rd Assault Brigade is that they had these kind of radio location stations, and they've got people on the front line spotting for drones, and they're very careful to say when the air is clear or when there's enemy aircraft in the air, and that's vital for making sure you can get to and from positions so you can get logistics in. But obviously the big danger of the war now is these fiber optic cables which don't give off a radio signal and rely on troops on the front line spotting them and reporting them back.
And does that heavier British-made or Western-made vehicle give the Ukrainians an advantage against these drones in terms of armor or anything?
The armor is thick, so the drones have to hit a specific place on the armor in order to do it. But we've seen that drone operators have got so good at finding weak spots, and the more they attack a particular type of weapon, the more likely they are to find those weak spots. We hadn't heard of any losses to drones with this unit, but they were very worried about them. They'd had situations where a drone had hit a barrel and it had set fire to it, but they managed to put it out. During episodes where drones had hit a tree that was near the thing, or the camouflage netting setting fire to that. So they are very worried about it. And then, I talked to them about the other thing that the Ukrainians are very keen on, the Challenger 2 tanks that have been provided to Ukraine. And they said, look, we've got the armor on this is nothing like as thick on the Challenger tank, so we don't want it to get hit by drones. We need to keep it under wraps. We need to keep it under cover. So they do feel vulnerable. They do like, how powerful the weapon is, the impact and the accuracy, and also the thing that they were talking about is the way that these weapons were designed compared to their Soviet era artillery that they used to have. That they were spacious, they were comfortable, they were designed with operators in mind, they were easy to load, they would enable a more rapid rate of fire. So they were happy with those developments, but they're still vulnerable to drones on the one battlefield.
And these artillery teams are playing a key role, as you say, in the defense of Izium, as well as other cities in eastern Ukraine. What's the situation on the front at the moment in Ukraine?
So it varies. So Izium is pretty much holding fast. The 3rd Assault Brigade is forming the 3rd Army Corps there, and they will be brought together and hopefully turned into what is a motivated fighting force that can hold the Russians at Izium and along that stretch of front. Further south in the Donbass, it's more difficult. Pokrovsk, an important garrison town, is now almost encircled. The Russians are on 3 sides, and they're also pushing forward to Konstantinivka, which is held out for an incredible period of time against Russian encirclement. But and the Ukrainians have inflicted incredible casualties on the Russians in them trying to take those towns. But it does look like it's now a matter of time before they fall. I mean, we've been saying this for months, but now it's really logistics lines are really jeopardized. It's difficult to see how the Ukrainians can continue to hold on to those towns without starting to have serious loss of life. And that becomes a kind of strategic political decision for Zelensky and General Syrskyi. How many Ukrainian lives do they want to spend holding on to these towns? Do they continue to make an issue, a symbolic gesture like in Fortress Bakhmut, especially at a time when Ukraine cannot afford to lose men in battles that can't be won?
Yeah, and we have seen Russia continuing their advance in some parts of Ukraine. But are there really any fears among the troops and the people you spoke to in Ukraine that Russia's capable of making serious strategic gains in what's being seen as their summer offensive?
I think a breakthrough to threaten a major city is unlikely in the summer, particularly given the number of casualties that the Russians are taking in trying to push for Pokrovsk or Konstantinivka. I do think that it's possible that Russia could take either one of those 2 towns, which does pose serious problems then for the Ukrainians. They'll have to mount a defense of Kramatorsk, which was long kind of the military headquarters in the Donbass. And that will be difficult undertaking for the Ukrainians. I think, given the problems with the logistical routes to Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, both of those, there is a danger, of course, that the Russians could encircle troops in those towns and cut them off. And if the Ukrainians allow that to happen, that would be a serious blow to Ukraine. Both strategically and also on a kind of motivation front, because there were a lot of troops in those towns defending them. So Ukraine will have to think very carefully about whether it starts to plan a staged withdrawal from those towns, or whether it decides to launch what could be a very expensive counterattack to kind of push the Russians back from the flanks there.
And elsewhere in Ukraine, the Russian drone and missile strikes have continued. 300 drones and 8 missiles launched at Ukraine just last night. With the arrival of those new Patriot batteries from the US, is there a sense that this bombardment could lift or start to be countered more effectively?
Well, I think, one of the places you actually feel the Sharheads the most is on the front lines. The Sharheads are used against frontline troops as well. You just have very little warning of when they're coming. And we experienced that, in very close quarters in Izium, when we had 2 Sharhead drones hit a building 300 meters away from us and pass about 10 meters over the top of the building. It's a terrifying noise. And 300 drones, it sounds like a lot, but, we've in recent weeks, we've had 700 drones attacking Ukraine. So obviously the Russians are able to scale up these attacks. They've showcased the Shahed drone factory at Alabuga. We've heard from soldiers on the ground that these drones are getting more sophisticated. They're now equipped with AI that allows them to evade interceptors that are being launched to bring them down. Patriots may be a solution when they come. We've heard a lot of talk about Patriots, but when they're actually going to be delivered, how they're going to be delivered, is still huge question marks over whether they'll even arrive in Ukraine this year. And it's very unlikely that they would use Patriots against the Shahed drones, because Patriots are so expensive. They're really the only defense that Ukraine has for ballistic missiles, so they'll probably save them for ballistic missile threats, some cruise missiles perhaps. But they're relying on a different form of technology. Before, it was very old-fashioned, sending jets out to shoot them down with short-range missiles or with cannons, sending out helicopters with machine guns on them to shoot down these drones, or jamming them to bring them down. As they're more and more automated and they're conducting evasive maneuvers, that becomes more difficult. And Ukraine is now pioneering these interceptor drones, which are essentially very rapid drones that are part piloted, and then when they get close to the target, they go into kind of heat-seeking mode. They're kind of a cross between a heat-seeking missile and a drone that is very fast and can intercept the Sharheads in the air. And that's, I think, what they're putting their hopes on, that they'll be able to do this. But every time there is a technological advancement by one side, the other side finds a way around it. So there's a constant game of cat and mouse in who can develop the Sharheads, who can develop the interceptors, and what modifications can you make it to make it more difficult to stop.
And on wider support from America for Ukraine, Donald Trump has announced these 25% tariffs on India. He said that's in part due to India buying Russian oil. He's also set that 10-day deadline for the Russians to come to some sort of agreement or come back to the table on the idea of a ceasefire. Is there a feeling that Trump might be moving away from Putin and towards Ukraine a bit more here?
Well, certainly the rhetoric is moving in Ukraine's favor, and Ukrainians are optimistic. They have to be optimistic about that, and that actually translating to some meaningful action, because so far the rhetoric hasn't translated to any meaningful action on their side for them. Look, it's very difficult. Trump says one thing, and then he changes his mind the next day. The Indian tariffs are supposed to come in tomorrow. Maybe a deal will be made in the interim, as it's happened with the EU and with others. It's interesting that if you're seeking to punish Russia, that you go after another country first. It suggests to me that Trump may still be very reluctant to actually impose harsh financial sanctions on Russia. And I don't know how really he expects the Russians to take a deadline seriously when it's not even clear when the deadline is. Is it 10 days? Is it 12 days? From what date? It's changed from 50 days. It's a very strange negotiating tactic to give a deadline which isn't clear. And the nature of these sanctions will still be is still unclear. It still hasn't been spelled out exactly what they'll look like. So I think there is reason for cautious optimism in Ukraine, but given Trump's previous closeness to Putin, given his particularly his financial relationships with several people in the Russian elite, it seems unlikely that he's going to put something very punitive or very damaging on the Russian economy. But I hope to be surprised by that.
And earlier this month, you were also writing about Yulia Servendenko, who became prime minister recently. She was directly involved in the minerals deal with the US as well. Presumably, she's viewed quite favorably by the Trump team, so they might be quite confident on this pick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think Yulia Sviridenko, I've interviewed her before. She's smart, personable, very charming, has picked a really good team to come into the cabinet with her. She's promoted her deputy ministers when she was Minister of the Economy to Deputy Prime Minister for European integration, and to the new Minister for Economy, who heads this kind of huge ministry that has also subsumed agrarian policy as well. I think that's interesting. She has a good relationship with Scott Bessent, having negotiated the rare earth minerals deal. She's widely considered to be a clean politician, in contrast to some of Zelensky's previous inner circle. And she's held in kind of high regard in Ukrainian civil society as well. So those are all positives in her favor. I think the downside and the criticism that she gets is that she is not an elected politician. She hasn't been an MP. She was working in the office of the president prior to joining the cabinet, and was working for Andriy Yermak, who is Zelensky's very powerful chief of staff. And so a lot of people have said, look, this is just another iteration of Andriy Yermak's control over cabinet. I think that may have been overstated, because she has been able to negotiate bringing two of her own ministers into important positions, and she's also negotiated kind of pushing out some of her rivals in cabinet. So I don't think she's an entirely dependent person. I think she will be good for negotiating with the US. I think a challenge is going to be for her, as somebody who has a reputation of being a clean politician in Ukraine, is to navigate these corruption scandals when they inevitably rear their head. And I think just days after coming into office, she will have been probably very unhappy privately to be confronted with this sudden bill which looked to remove the independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies and put the country into a huge scandal, both inside domestically and with its external partners, who are wondering why Zelensky is trying to make its anti-corruption bodies dependent on the presidential office, essentially, and the prosecutor general, who reports to the president. It looks like those moves have been warded off now because of the protests in Kiev and because of very strong international reaction to them. There is a bill that should be passed today, which would restore the independence. But I'm sure that the issue with corruption and the issue with corruption in Zelensky's circle particularly hasn't gone away, and the investigation that the National Anti-Corruption Bureau launched into the former Deputy Prime Minister Chernyshov is probably going to reveal links to other actors in the government, and that could get very uncomfortable for Zelensky and very uncomfortable for Sviridenko, who was brought in as a kind of a reform-minded person who is improving the business environment in Ukraine and is cleaning up corruption.